Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of TAROE Trust's Wednesday webinar series. Today, we're going to be looking at a slightly off-topic, but extremely topical issue, given today's cost of living crisis, where we'll be welcoming a guest speaker from the Trussell Trust. Before we do that, just a few things just to remind everyone, we're going to be recording this session. It should be up on our YouTube channel later on today. So it may be that some of you are watching this on playback as a recording. So thanks for joining, and thanks for everybody who is here in person today. I'm really pleased to announce that we're going to be joined by Sim Ilyas. Sim is the Financial Inclusion Lead for England at the Trussell Trust. So he's going to be delivering a presentation and talking through some of the very valuable, important work that the Trussell Trust are doing in relation to food poverty. As we look at inflation, significantly increasing costs across the board, and the impact that that's having on families, then it's never been a more important role and time for the work of the Trussell Trust. I'm sure that I've been monitoring some of their work over recent years, and I know that demand has been growing exponentially, and it's almost really sad, isn't it? Because I think one of the success factors of their work is that the need for them not to exist anymore, because we can address the whole issue of food poverty. So, which leads quite nicely as a segue onto the whole series which we're doing here on our Wednesday webinars. What some of you may have seen that we've been highlighting in the newsletters is that we're really keen to be able to continue with these sessions on a free to access basis, because we think it's really important that tenants across the sector are able to get access to information and knowledge about topical issues. So these continue to be our webinar Wednesdays continue to be on a free to access basis, and we hope that they are valued and well received by the sector. So we'll do things a little bit different. I'm going to hand over to Leslie now as the chair, and Leslie and Sim are going to run the session. Leslie does know Sim already from other activities outside of TAROE Trust. So it was really good through that relationship. That's how we've managed to be introduced to Sim. So I'll be here in the background. I'll be making a note of questions as well. And alongside the other attendees today, I'm sure we'll be thinking of lots of questions to ask Sim about that valuable work. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've actually been in a webinar Wednesday session. I've been busy with a social media course. So I have actually really missed seeing you all and participating, because I think these are really valuable sessions that we are running. So welcome, everyone. And I'm happy to be back. I am really looking forward to hearing Sim speak today. As you know, or may not know, he is going to be talking about the Trussell Trust and the work that they're doing, but also the work that you might not know. I know that they are considered the food bank people, and I have interviewed their organization with part of Housing Day a few years ago, when we were looking at community investment within that theme. So I will hand over. I know Sim has a presentation that he's going to share and talk through for about 20 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A. And as Darren said, any questions that you think about coming up while Sim is talking, just put them in the chat, and then Darren can feed them back to us when Sim is completed. So over to you, Sim. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Darren, as well for the invite today. It's always good to get involved with organisations like yours, because the overlap in the work that we do is really well established. It's more or less academic. I thought it would be useful actually to start with a welcome. Obviously, great to see everyone that's turned in today to take part in the session, but also say a few words about my background, so you've got a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of the role that I've recently started with the Trussell Trust. So I've been working mainly in the charitable voluntary sector, not-for-profit organisations for about 20 years now. Cut my teeth with a debt advice organisation, so maybe I never actually take my debt advisor hat off. And that's the kind of organisation where if you've got financial issues, you've got financial problems, you would go to get advice on a free-to-client basis, so not a fee-charging company. We just work alongside the likes of Step Change, Citizens Advice, those types of organisations to help people alleviate their financial issues. As everybody probably knows that's on this call today, none of the issues that we deal with day to day are the types of issues that exist in isolation. A debt problem is usually connected to a housing problem, is usually connected to a welfare benefits problem, and so it goes on. You can never really resolve one issue with the hope of improving a person's circumstances. That's why these types of events are really critical. They're really important because it does what we're supposed to do in the sector, which is collaborate with each other, work in a joined up way by connecting the necessary dots. But it also demonstrates that we're actually providing what we consider to be a holistic solution to a problem, because we are addressing the individual component parts that all connect together rather than a single issue. And it's probably fair to say that where you do just deal with a single issue, yes, that will be a sticking plaster. It'll deal with the firefight approach of addressing that single issue. But the chances are, because you haven't looked at the other issues as well, that person will be back with you in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, because the underlying needs and the other issues and stuff haven't been addressed in a comprehensive way. A lot of what I'll discuss when I bring up my presentation in a moment is this idea, this notion that actually the Trussell Trust does really vital work in all the communities that we operate in, and where across the UK we've got, you know, in excess of 1,400 food bank centres now. And we're doing really vital work in the community, but that is addressing a kind of firefight need. And that need is based on people presenting with not enough food in their kitchens and then their larder cupboards and their fridges to be able to meet the needs of their family and be able to stay healthy themselves. We address that need by providing food bank support, but an underlying theme of what we talk about all the time is this notion that in the long term, we want to become obsolete. And that might sound a little bit kind of whimsical, fantastical, because what we do day to day is provide food bank support, but actually our objectives in that regard are an acknowledgement of the fact that food bank support is not the problem. People don't struggle here because of a food issue, people struggle here because of an income issue. And that's something that's reflected in the presentation, and it'll be something that I talk about in more depth when we talk about the presentation as well. But my background is working for local debt advice providers in Bristol, where I'm based. I've worked for a national institute for money advice. I've also done a stint with Citizens Advice and with an insolvency practitioner. More recently, I worked for a credit union, and I landed with the Trussell Trust about three and a half months ago, something like that. But my work has always centered around this notion that financial well-being is a really crucial component of somebody's overall well-being. So again, in the same sort of way, if you look at a person's well-being, you can never just address it by looking at one specific area. So for example, you can't just focus on your diet and expect to be okay. You've got to focus on your physical well-being, your emotional well-being, your financial well-being, your social welfare, your family relationships, your work relationships, and so it goes on. And again, in the same sort of way, looking at that in a kind of holistic sense is what seems to have the biggest kind of level of success. Okay, what I'm going to do now is share my screen and run through the presentation. That'll be about 15-20 minutes. And then, of course, the most interesting bit of these kinds of presentations is always the Q&A. So please think of your questions, note them down in the chat, or feel free to just raise them at the end verbally. All right, give me a moment here.
That's great, Sim. We can see the presentation. It's not in presentation mode yet, but yeah, we can see it.
Okay, lovely stuff. So you should now see the opening slide with the pictures on the right and my details on the left.
So we're seeing it with your sort of notes page as well. So it's in the
Okay, hang on a second. Let
Do
me
they
just
call
see.
it presenter view, I think?
Yeah, let me just shift this out of presenter view if I can. Apologies. Okay, that may have gone back into presenter view. If you don't mind,
We can still see it, Sim.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it means it's just slightly smaller on one end of the screen rather than the full screen. But let's not waste too much more time trying to get me to deal with these technical issues. Let's run through the presentation and then we can have a little chat about it. So, I'm the financial inclusion lead for England. I look after the Trussell Trust work around financial inclusion. So a big component part of addressing the need for food banks is dealing with people's financial issues, because guess what? One of the main reasons why people present at a food bank is because they've got underlying financial problems relating to debt, relating to unpaid rent, council tax bills, that kind of thing. And that's the reason why they can't afford to put food on the table. So what we try and do through the Trust's activities is give people the kind of support through financial inclusion services that will help them deal with those underlying issues around their money, and therefore maybe not need the food bank support that they've had previously on such a regular basis. As far as the Trussell Trust is concerned, we're a national charity. You may or may not have heard of us, but our mainstay and the work that we do day to day is providing food bank support to a network of now over 1,400 centres. The Independent Food Aid Network represents more than 500 independent food bank charities across the UK, and they're to provide emergency support for people locked in poverty. And that's the critical thing, I suppose. This isn't a food issue, this is a poverty issue, and therefore it's relating to income. Since the beginning, the food bank network that's run by the Trussell Trust has kind of sat under this overarching campaign around the need to end the need for food banks in the UK. And this is something that we continue to do even to this day. What we fundamentally believe around our vision is that it's not right that anybody should be left hungry, and it's not right that anybody should be left in poverty. We're working for change. We're providing the emergency support that people need, but we're doing that in a compassionate, dignified way. And we're helping people that are locked in crisis. And that's the critical thing, I suppose. We're putting people in a position where even if they're in crisis and it's very difficult for them to reach out for that support, we do it in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're victims. It doesn't make them feel like they're embarrassed or ashamed having to come get for that support. We have a really clear understanding through the kind of networks that we're operating and through the people that we employ, what will be required in terms of ending the need for food hunger. And that is one of the major drivers that we're moving towards. But there are lots and lots of things that play into that as well, which we'll cover off on the next few slides. Demand has already been mentioned by Darren. This is something that you can pick up very, very easily looking at any elements of the media day to day, because the Trussell Trust and other food bank support charities, and there are a few out there, will do chapter and verse on this every single day. One of the key statistics is the second bullet point there about the percentage increase year on year versus the number of food bank support parcels that we delivered in the previous year. So 2.1 million, 21 and 22, and that's gone up again this year again. We anticipate it's going to be further increase, further demand. A really notable statistic was the number of those food bank parcels which went to children, and that's households where there is at least one child present in the household. Child poverty is something that resonates with the government, that resonates with people all the time, because they especially don't want people who are below a certain age threshold, 16, to be going hungry day to day, because of the impact that can have on their welfare, their health, their concentration, their development as a young person. It does resonate with the government, but then of course we get to the problem where the government again and again changes the guidelines of what is defined as child poverty, what those statistics look like, how well they're doing, how not well they're doing. But as you can imagine, we report those statistics in a fairly straightforward way. On the topic of increasing demand, one of the key themes that we're noticing across our network is at the moment those demand statistics are just going up and up. One of the key indicators of that is that the food bank network that we support They independently raise money because all of those organizations are independent charities of their own, in their own right, the same way that Citizens Advice is. A lot of the money that they're raising day to day is actually now being spent on buying food to donate to people rather than just receiving donations from supermarkets and from individuals and different places like that. We've got really established networks within the supermarket network, for example. So they will donate to us the food that hasn't been purchased by people, which is nearing sell-by dates and use-by dates and stuff like that. They'll also provide the big hampers at the end of the supermarket checkout section where people can donate their tins of beans or whatever it is that they want to give on a regular basis. But more and more we're noticing that even those donations, which have been extremely generous over the last few years, are now dwindling or have plateaued out at a certain level. And because the individual food banks are not meeting the demand within their communities, they're having to buy additional food to be able to donate. And that, more than anything at the moment, is a very clear indicator of the kind of situation that we're facing with cost of living crisis, with inflationary increases, with cost of utilities going up, and all the different things that are impacting people's ability to buy food and cover their financial essential expenditure. The key issues that we identify, which actually contribute to the reason why people present at food banks in the first place, is around these kind of main three areas, these fundamental areas. So, first of all, income insufficiency. By far the largest statistic in this kind of field is to do with the fact that people don't have enough income to meet their essential expenditure, and that's the red category there. The second biggest factor that contributes to this is delays in receiving benefits, and that's simply a case of a big component part of some of these income strands being benefit related, and there's been some delays with the DWP around how those benefits get paid. The third factor can be changes to benefits, and with something like universal credit, some of you may know from first-hand experience, it doesn't take an awful lot to upset the apple cart, because a lot of the time the sanctions and changes and the delays that can be associated with people's circumstances where universal credit does change can really upset the situation and put people in dire straits as far as being able to meet their financial liabilities are concerned. So what we're looking at there is not just those factors outlined on the left, but also the issues that can be associated with other areas of life. So lack of informal support, people not understanding what benefits are entitled to, cost of living crisis we've referenced already, but sudden illness and major changes in circumstances, and a growing factor at that final point there about in-work poverty. So it might surprise some people to hear, although it might not as well, that actually a lot of the time the people that are approaching us for food bank support are the people who are in work, they're what you might consider to be earning a reasonable living, but they're still not able to meet all their essential expenditure. And this is an ongoing and growing problem. So how will we get there? How will we put ourselves in a position where food bank support is something that we slowly dwindle down and eventually we are able to stop altogether? What we need to do is bring about change. But as we all know, change is one of the most difficult things to manifest, especially when it comes to really enduring problems around the cost of living, around culture and different things like that. So what are we going to do? We're going to focus on changing communities. We're already doing that because we're out there working in communities every single day. What we want to do is provide local support for all. I think that there isn't really a community in the UK now where some prevalence of food bank support, either through the Trussell Trust or through a different provider, isn't available. In some ways, that's great because we're plugging a great big hole in the system there. But in some ways, that's also telling of a huge societal problem as far as the things that ought to be provided for by the government, by the state, but also through things like security at work with your employment, being paid enough money for the job that you work. Housing security and other things like that as well. Welfare benefits, of course, is a huge thing within that as well. What we need to do is change minds as well. There is this enduring problem of people assuming that, you know, if they look after themselves, the rest of the issues really can be put on the back burner or ignored altogether. We need to change the system where we've currently got people who consider other people's problems to be other people's problems and take a more societal approach around looking after people, making sure everyone can thrive and removing those stigmas around what is acceptable and not in society in terms of how much you should work, what people can do if they can work, people's receipt of disability benefits and all the different things that contribute to this kind of thing. And this final point here on the right to do with policy change. A national policy change is a fundamental thing in all of this. So a lot of the really kind of high level changes that could happen, like a universal basic income, for example, those are long-term things that we could kind of lobby for in the future. They're not going to happen in an instant because those are fundamental changes to our welfare benefit system, which will have to come with a change in government, a change in policy around what is considered to be acceptable, possibly the kinds of things that happen on a generation by generation basis, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be working towards them. Here's a bit more detail on the strategy of the Trussell Trust and how we're actually working with different organisations and different partners, and I'll talk a bit more about partnership further down the line as well. But as you can see, it's a very complicated picture. As much as I emphasised before that none of the issues exist in isolation, as you can appreciate, none of the solutions are therefore going to be formed in isolation. There's no single organisation, no single body that's going to be able to bring about the kinds of changes which are required to improve the lives of the most vulnerable. It has to be partnership work. It has to be around all the factors and areas covered on the previous slide and all of the factors and areas covered on this slide as well, which, as you can see, is tremendously complicated. Don't worry about noting down any of the detail here. I will be sharing this presentation with Leslie and with Darren, with you guys as well, after we finish today. So you can then go over it in a bit more detail and feel free to come back to me with any questions that you might have as well. Next area then is the bit of the business that I look after. So financial inclusion work is a really major strand of what we do with the Trussell Trust day to day. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that people struggle so much with their day-to-day finances. It causes debt problems, it causes financial exclusion issues. So we need to bring about changes in our program to ensure that people are financially included. And the way that we operate that is through a network, which is based within the food bank network, but actually it's this notion that if you present at a food bank, we don't just give you a parcel of food and say, right, we'll see you next week. It's also this sense that we'll give people the opportunity to sit down and discuss the need why they've presented at the food bank in the first place. A really common answer to that question about why people have presented at a food bank is because I'm struggling with my debts, I'm struggling with my finances, I'm struggling to make ends meet and pay the bills. If we can provide people with the kind of guidance that's required to improve their situation at that stage, that's going to be a potential solution, if not short-term, but definitely long-term, around why they might not present at the food bank the next time around, why the need to have 3 days worth of food bank support isn't then followed by a further 3 days and then a further 3 days, and then so it goes on and it becomes a cycle. We want to break the cycle of food poverty by giving people the kind of advice that's going to improve their financial situation. It therefore addresses the root causes of financial crisis. One of those could be something around income insufficiency. One of those could be something around welfare benefit entitlement. For instance, people have got this benefit entitlement that they were not aware of, so we help them apply for it. There are other things that happen within that category as well, as you can imagine. So what we're trying to do is connect people at the right time to the right support. That can be support within the food bank network where we're partnering with the Citizens Advice, for example, or it can be signposted into other organisations and other types of support which are available in their community. It's working towards preventing people having the ongoing need for emergency food support and addressing that altogether if it's possible. The programme itself then works with, as I've mentioned before, a network within the food bank network. So attached to the people that provide the food is a support system of funding managers, financial inclusion managers, and a toolkit that we avail online, and the support that's available through our partners like Citizens Advice. There's a helpline service which is associated with that as well, and the whole notion of this is around a cross-cutting approach. So it isn't that we've got a one-size-fits-all. We've got the various different services that are available face-to-face, over the phone, and through a signposting service to other organisations as well. One of the key partnerships that we've got is with Citizens Advice. What we didn't want to do is reinvent the wheel. What we do is provide food bank support, but what we acknowledge that other people do, for example, Citizens Advice, is provide guidance to people around their debt. So it didn't make any sense for us to start creating a service when we could just partner with local Citizens Advice and make that service available within the communities that we're serving. So this is an answer to the question, how do you give people advice within the food bank network? You partner with an existing organisation and you make it happen through the likes of Citizens Advice and Mind, which is also a national charity. The Mind project has become even more successful now, and we're going to be rolling out further stages and further food bank support in terms of advice around mental health and advice around debts through the food bank network in the coming weeks. I think there's another 30 partners or 30 local community partnerships which are being announced in the next fortnight. One of the other partnerships that we've got is through some organisation called the Child Poverty Action Group, which you may not have heard of. They provide us with training and resources to help upskill our financial inclusion team. They also provide the second tier support that we need for more sophisticated issues. And it's through this kind of partnership work that we resolve the more enduring and difficult problems, the kinds of problems where necessarily somebody previously had to go and hadn't had an awful lot of success because it's to do with, I don't know, a complicated tenancy or a legal issue around council tax collection and that kind of thing. A specialist second tier support through an organisation like CPAG is really, really helpful. We've got other kind of local community partnerships as well, where, for example, through the Manchester Poverty Action Group, we created the Money Advice Referral Tool and other resources and leaflets like the Worrying About Money leaflet that was printed through these guys as well. Step Change is a national provider that you may or may not have heard of. We've got 2 pilots. Actually, we're through the pilot stage now. This presentation is about a month old. So because we move really fast as an organisation, a lot of the time these projects and initiatives have actually moved on quite some distance. This has gone beyond the pilot stage now, has been successful. It's going to be embedded as an ongoing programme for referrals in for debt advice for people who can't reach a face-to-face appointment, and also for issuing food bank vouchers over the phone as well. These kind of partnerships, they go on all the time in organisations that we're well established with, but we're also keen to establish partnerships with new organisations through housing providers, for instance, and through other partners, potential partners that are working in the communities already. In keeping with what I said before about not wanting to reinvent the wheel, we know that there are organisations out there are people out there who are experts in their field, and we want to draw upon their expertise. This whole notion of, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants, we love that. And we want to draw upon that expertise to make sure that whatever we can do in terms of the contribution that we can make to improve people's lives in local communities all around the country is being done in the most effective possible way. And that's why these kinds of discussions are really crucial. They're really critical because it makes a big difference knowing that you've got the option of referring to a Trussell Trust food bank to immediately address the need that somebody hasn't got food that day, and that will be dealt with for the next 3 days because that's the length of time that the food parcel is expected to last for. But actually, it's also a mechanism for ensuring that where other advice needs exist, we can address those through signposting, referral, and partnership work. That's the end of the presentation. What I'll do is stop sharing my screen. Looks like the chat has been quite active, and then potentially we'll open it up. But I'll hand back to Leslie for a moment whilst I grab a little sip of water, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Sim. I have a couple of questions for Sim, but I think that, you know, it's really interesting. I was just Googling some stuff while Sim was talking because I was making a lot of notes that there is actually year on year 16 billion people that are entitled to, but with the welfare reform change, it seems to be the barriers for either people applying or getting denied or not filling out the form correctly, it seems really bad. And the other thing is the reduction of the threshold to qualify for free school meals, which was a really big help for people that were on the lower socioeconomic scale. And that has been reduced to, I think, about 7,500 a year to qualify, which is just absolutely, I think, bonkers. I think there's several things that I want to talk about, but there is Rory Stewart is a former Tory MP. He ran against Boris and lost, but He's now involved in a charity called Give Directly, and working with countries abroad, looking at aid, foreign aid, and looking at putting cash in people's hand as opposed to thinking about what they need. So it's moving, and it goes exactly with what you were saying, Sim, about looking at, it isn't a food problem, it is a cash problem. And that by having someone go to a food bank, do they still have to qualify, have to get a physical referral from a GP or someone to go? They can't just show up, correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is that they will be referred to a food bank by a local authority, by a GP, by a citizens advice
So
service.
they have
all of those.
to ask for help and not just kind of covertly show up, which I think is also a barrier. Now, I'm going to pull my own covers here. When I am a single parent. I've been a single parent since my youngest was about 10 months old. I was living in social housing, now a rental social property. Now I'm a shared owner. But there were times when my children were really young and I was not yet working, but I was volunteering at my housing association. I had to go to a food bank. And for me, the shame of having to ask for help was the one thing. And then when I went, the people were really, really nice. And part of, and they kind of sometimes offer you, they kind of have you sit down, give you a cup of tea if you want, and just, have you talk, and they actually listen to you. So it's really this service isn't just about collecting the food, and that's what you were alluding to today. So, sure. When I was hosting Housing Day back, I think in 2018 or 2019, it was pre-COVID. Potsway Housing, which is my local housing association, actually have their food bank in-house. They have part of their and we were able to interview them and kind of see what they were able to do. So I mean, I think it's fantastic, but it's also about encouraging people that if you need the help to overcome that initial shame that you actually have to ask for help. And I know that you were talking also in your presentation about the stigma that is attached, that somehow, that the comments on social media is that people should be able to afford, to pay for their own stuff. And I think that one of the narratives that has to be made really clear is that 40% of people that are on universal credit are working. Like you said, a lot of people are working, and the work and the pay that they have doesn't cover. So I think that there's a lot of around, I'm just working on a project with a housing association at the moment, where I'm just writing out the project, looking at stigma in a specific area, comparing it to national. Around social housing stigma, and a lot of it is based on assumptions, and that as you were saying about, it's not my problem, it isn't my problem, they need to take care of themselves. And it's obviously
that's a really interesting point, Leslie, and I think that's actually reflected in a few of the points that have been made in the chat as well, about how although we are all tackling the issues around the cost of living increase, the inflationary increases, utility costs going sky high, actually what we're talking about day to day for most people is a real-time reduction in the amount that they've been paid, because the increases in salaries don't reflect inflationary increases at all. So actually what we've got is a fairly stagnant position as far as income is concerned, but most people costs have been continuing to go through the roof. That puts people in a really difficult position. Thank you, Deb, as well, for pointing out that actually, yes, there's a referral network relying on a referral system with the Trussell Trust and with other food banks. With food pantries, however, you can just turn up and there is other kind of one-off support that you can access where it doesn't require a referral if you're really in dire straits. And that, as as a patchwork, as a kind of combined piece, as far as all the different types of support that are available out there, is essential in many communities that that we're operating in. Picking up on your point there, Leslie, about the it's not my problem. We encounter this all the time, and actually this is one of the major challenges as far as policy change is concerned and the lobbying work that we do, because unless we're able to influence those decision makers high up in government and in certain positions within government departments, this is going to be an ongoing challenge, because there needs to be the political will to bring about change here. One of the major ways that we're able to actually influence that, though, is this notion of the impact on the public purse. And that does seem to have a kind of resonance with a lot of people. It does seem to make a difference. If we don't solve these problems now, later down the line, that person, that individual who you haven't supported is going to become a much bigger burden on the public purse than you would have anticipated anyway, simply because unsupported needs here, which is a really teeny tiny problem that can be addressed relatively easily with a small amount of funding, turns into much bigger issues further down the line in terms of the impact on the NHS, for example. That person needs medical interventions because of stress, because of anxiety, because their underlying health needs haven't been dealt with, and therefore it turns into a much bigger problem. Now, that's just one example of how these things can mushroom into something huge, because needs and wants that are addressed here tend to be relatively easy to fix, but there's got to be the political will. Because that doesn't happen, people end up on a much longer kind of route to getting into that well-being position, because, for example, a stress problem becomes a depression problem becomes really deeply manifested. It then requires medical intervention and becomes issues around the welfare of their children as well. So
and you also have,
and
then you also have behind all this, within the last couple of years, a mass disabling event of there's over 2.2 million people currently living with long COVID, and people that there's been a huge reduction in the workforce. So therefore, people that haven't accessed benefits typically before, there's been a huge uptick in the people wanting or having to access financial support, which is also compounding the whole, because that has to be paid from, it's all, health, housing, food poverty, cost of living. And I think that where there was it's like you were saying, it's just all the kind of complex issues kind of coming together to a point. And I think that the kind of changing narrative after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and this narrative of the income, the coalition government of this deserving and undeserving poor has really taken off. And it's
it definitely has taken off, and it's one of those enduring problems that we've got. And as much as you don't want these conversations to kind of slip into a kind of political back and forth, at the same time we have to acknowledge that where there is a welfare focus, where there's a will to help the most vulnerable people, there tends to be action taken in that front. And where there isn't, because people are more focused on other objectives, and it's about a kind of capitalist approach to people looking after their own interests, their own needs, that tends to be the focus. It's an inevitable part of it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to bring James in. You got your hand up, James. Sorry, I just saw you. You need to take yourself off mute.
Forgets after a day.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you very much for your presentation, Sim. Very interesting. I have two short questions. Can housing associations provide, via tenant support, food or fuel bank vouchers to at-risk residents? And the second question is, how many times can a user access a food bank? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, James. Very good ones. The answer to the first question is yes. We've got food bank partnerships up and down the country where we receive referrals from registered social landlords such as yours, and that is a known route, that is a known strategy for dealing with poverty and food deprivation within the communities. We have guidelines around the amount of times that people can be referred. At the moment, people are having to adopt a much more flexible approach on the number of times they can receive a food bank voucher, because without that, people will be just left in poverty. And we can't necessarily adopt the position that we adopt and stand by and let that happen, even though we do have these notional guidelines, because we don't want people to become dependent. We don't want people to have the mechanism for not accessing that support if they really, really need it. At the same time, one of the ways of addressing that is to make sure that people don't just present with food bank vouchers week on week. We do that approach of putting our arm around them and saying, right, tell us about the underlying issues here, which is the work of my team day to day.
How long does that actually take to implement? Because I know that, you know, applying for benefits can take, you know, the forms are really long, it can take a long time. As you said, one of the biggest things is the delay in benefit. I know that it's like a 30-day or 4, but then to get actually qualified takes a long time.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, it could be said that that's a kind of piece of string question, because the solutions to the problems that that person needs could be straightforward and immediate. Like a phone call to a local authority can give rise to immediate steps being taken, which will alleviate their position. It can be more complicated, like an application for DWP style benefits, right? On the other hand, we have guidelines and a framework within which our teams operate, and it is the notion that you are dealing with the most pressing issues first, and maximizing somebody's income is one of those pressing issues, and then working in a kind of hierarchical way to ensure that the needs are addressed in a logical order. So that will usually put people in an improved position more or less immediately, but actually on an ongoing basis in terms of these things that take a bit longer.
I'm going to bring in Deb and then Cyril. So Deb, what was your question?
I was just going to respond to the housing association element, because obviously I work for a housing association. I wanted to say that we also fund the premises that Trussell Trust work out of. So you are using one of our buildings in which to function from. It's more complex than that. We have a full range of officers, from money advice and benefits, wellbeing, employment and training, tenancy sustainment, and I could go on. And what we are now doing is when we get individuals that are referred to us, we are doing pre-tenancy checks, but on a much more thorough basis, because we are finding that we are having people who are coming from supported environments, who have off the streets, have got long-term issues, and we're not getting that disclosure. And what we're finding is we're having to act on their behalf. So it's not about them doing the forms. It's not about them being aware of what they are entitled to. It's the fact that they cannot do this for themselves. So we're acting as advocates on a permanent basis. One of our advantages is we're not time constrained, and we've worked with people for quite some considerable time. And just to raise, in the last month, we have just got a back date of £24,000 for someone. Benefits actually going to appeal, and that's absolutely life-changing, staggering and shocking. The job centres, we find, do not provide assistance or help. They're simply signposting, and for people who are not able to deal with information in the way we are, and this is why I keep talking about ACEs and advanced childhood experiences, and the fact that they just can't function. And if they're in a state already, asking them to be reasonable and fill in a form and actually respond or go along to another person in another service in another place is not going to work. So it's a perfect storm. But I like to say that, you know, I completely concur that we don't and shouldn't have food banks, but I also think that we should be providing free school meals right through school, and it would actually save money in the end. I actually think we should be looking at how we work with families much earlier. And I'm embedded in one of the areas of the highest social deprivation in the country. And I can tell you that we're dealing with multi-generational issues where some of the damage is so profound that we can just help and smooth it off and fix bits, but we can't radically change people's lives, which means our intervention is ongoing, and it will be for the foreseeable.
Thank you, Deb. And the one thing I wanted to just is that 70% of PIP and ESA cases that go to tribunal get overturned in favor of the person applying. So it is worth following that through, but it can take up to a year or more. And yes, it's nice to have it backdated, but while you're waiting and having to go through it or not feeling like you're being believed, it can be really, really taxing on someone's mental health. So I just encourage anyone that's watching this to, you know, get someone either from Citizens Advice, or if it's a specific, you know, I know that Macmillan, for example, offer support for the people that they work, you know, different organizations help to navigate that, but it shouldn't be that hard to navigate. It shouldn't be, you know, housing associations having to navigate the benefit system for people. It should be easily more accessible, and the barrier should not be you know, that you have to then go on and fight and take it to a tribunal. It can be absolutely harrowing. So well done for that case. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, but it is absolutely heartbreaking, because a lot of people have also in the long COVID community have just kind of given up. They've been turned down for PIP or ESA because they didn't reach the threshold or didn't fill out the form correctly, you know, and it's just, it shouldn't be too complicated.
And just to say, just going to add very quickly that we are doing, and we do have, and we are funding pantries over and above. And one of the issues is when food banks are actually open. So we get requests every single day, every single hour for food. And obviously we're appreciative that these places can't be open 7 days a week, but we're also providing now white goods, school uniform, grants for training, and yet we're being told by the Department for Work and Pension they are sitting on pots of money and no one's applying. But when our guys go and ask for it, they're told, go find somewhere else. And the reason is, behind the scenes, we were told the staff in the job centres feel that the administration for funds is too onerous, so they avoid it.
I'm going to Cyril, yes.
I realise you're going to go to Cyril in a moment. Before you just on, so it remains on subject for that issue. I think Deb's highlighted just, you know, a vast array of things which are both positive things that landlords can do, and also a number of the barriers which I think was echoed in the chat with Sandy as well. We're saying about how there's just lots of barriers which put people off being able to access the support. Can I just ask a question to Sim though, to say, it's kind of a lottery. You know, person A's landlord might be doing lots in this arena, but persons B and C might be doing nothing at all. So if somebody's landlord is not currently engaging with the Trussell Trust, and there's not those referral arrangements in place, or they're not hosting or have a relationship with the Trussell Trust, Sim, is there a way in which we could kind of signpost landlords to you? Do they just approach you directly? Is that the way that those relationships are established?
That's a really good observation. Thank you, Darren. I mean, that picks up very nicely on Debbie's very, you know, well-observed comments around, you know, the provision that's available through a social landlord that's accepting that level of responsibility, and all of them should be. Let's assume that we can agree that all of them should be. However, that's not happening. We know that that's not happening because there is this inconsistent approach of varying levels of support that are available through a social landlord, if at all, right? If a social landlord wants to have a policy change and wants to adopt a more ongoing working relationship with a Trussell Trust or with another food bank provider, that will be received with open arms. It definitely will. So all they need to do is approach us, and we can connect with the appropriate team. I can facilitate that, no problem at all.
How many? And I will be bringing in, so how many? Because I know quite a few that actually provide spaces for Trussell Trust to have their food banks and you know, have spaces, because obviously private renting is really expensive, and that is you know, I think one of the overheads that Trussell Trust has to deal with.
I'm unable to give you the statistics, but we do our network relies on community organizations like social landlords to deliver the services that we deliver. We need a physical base to provide food bank support. You know, that's a very straightforward proposition to get your head around. And social landlords are critical in ensuring that. That's also an acknowledgement of oftentimes social landlord tenants being our regular visitors in terms of the food bank support that we provide. So joining up those services in that kind of provisioned way is a very sensible thing to do. Cyril, come in. You've been really patient.
Okay, fine. Thanks very much. This is really a question for Sim. And I put it in the chat, but I'll repeat it now. How effective are relationships with credit unions in your experience? membership of a credit union requires the ability to save. So how realistic is it to promote credit unions to food bank users?
I feel like I've got the ability to comment on this with some knowledge, because I've spent 3.5 years working for the biggest credit union in the Southwest. So having done that and now working for the Trussell Trust, I really fully appreciate the point that you're making, and I think it's a really valid observation. A key component of financial well-being is the ability to weather financial shocks. And the ability to weather a financial shock usually relies on someone's ability to set aside small amounts of money on an ongoing basis. So when the financial shock hits, they're able to deal with that through their savings rather than having to borrow at the last minute. Now, what you touch upon is a really pertinent and a prevalent issue across communities across the country, and that is that most people will say that they are breaking even every month, every week, or they're going beyond their budgeting every month or every week, and they're ending up in a negative budget. So they're spending more than they're bringing in. The ability to save within that context is severely compromised, if non-existent. And I fully acknowledge that notion that people should be able to improve their financial well-being by saving is not a realistic possibility right now for people who are already in dire straits and struggling to pay the bills, keep food on the table, keep the roof over their heads, and that kind of thing. The good news is, I suppose, that kind of evidence, that kind of conversation proves to be very compelling to organizations like the Money and Pension Service, where one of their given guidelines around financial well-being, a component part of financial well-being, is the ability to save. So we say to them, okay, here's an element of government that's telling us that we should be saving, but actually here's another element of government that's not putting people in the position where they're allowed to save. Those two things clashing against each other, that dichotomy is quite a compelling policy piece, quite a compelling policy argument. And it does turn the heads of people within certain departments of government, not entirely turn their heads, not entirely put them in a position where they're making different choices and they're making policies which are in keeping with addressing that problem, but it makes them stop and pay attention. But I fully agree with your point that partnership piece around credit unions and saving on a regular basis, it's an ideal world, should be happening type scenario, but it isn't right now for everyone.
Thank you very much.
The other question I have is, when people come to the Trussell Trust, do you monitor who, what tenure they're from? Because I am expecting or assuming that also a growing number of private rental tenants are coming to you, because the private rental sector is really expensive, and people are getting evicted all the time. Rents are being raised. There's no kind of rent control. And universal credit, as we know, even if people are applying for universal credit, only covers up to a certain amount. So are you actually having those figures documented, like the percent?
Yeah, one thing that the Trussell Trust is extremely good at is data capture. Okay, so either we do that independently through our own CRM, or we work with our partners like Citizens Advice, for example, through Casebook, and they will gather that information because, as you say, much in the way that I reflected to Cyril just now, in terms of compelling evidence that's going to prove a point. If we approach a government department and we say, right, this is our assertion about what's happening in communities up and down the UK, their usual response is, prove it. Tell us how. How can you demonstrate that this is the case? And the way that we're able to do that is by gathering the kind of data that you're talking about, Leslie. So yes, we do that. And we do highlight issues on the basis of hard data, because these days that's the only way we can do it.
And from what I've read just recently about your campaigning, is that the growing number of food bank users is people that are in work, that is now, whereas before it was less so, but now that is the growing number of people that are in work having to utilize your services.
We had more months in the last 12 months where the fastest growing group within our user group was working age people in jobs, in work, than any other group. And
that actually is the kind of biggest section of society that experiences the highest stigma, in work people in the working age group. Yeah.
I think that there's been some really well-observed comments in the chat about the stigma issue. And I think the points that have been raised about, pay it forward in your community, think of it as something, the opposite of something that's got a negative stigma attached to it, are really well-made comments. And they do the job of convincing people, persuading people that the right thing to do is get support before it turns into a bigger problem. That's easier said than done with some service users, definitely, because proud people who've always supported themselves, stood on their own 2 feet, always had a job, always earned a good living, all of a sudden find themselves in this position through circumstances which are outside of their control, usually ill health, usually a change in circumstances as far as their job is concerned. In the pandemic particularly, that happened a lot. And that's tough. That's really tough for those people to go to a food bank and seek that kind of support. But whatever we can do within our communities to help address some of those stigma type issues is a really wise investment within our local communities, definitely.
Sam, just picking up on what you were saying also on issues around tenure and housing. It'll be interesting to see over the coming year or in the next few years, just kind of what's the prevalence of people living within the regulated or social housing sector that are kind of presenting themselves at food banks, because we talk about a lot of well-known kind of almost perfect storm issues, which you highlighted at the beginning of your talk about how you've got kind of stagnated wages, you've got almost hyperinflation in some areas, and the causation factors there cover things like the global issues, the war, Brexit, inflation as well, about structural economic issues, which we've got internally as well. But we've got some sector-specific things which are going to really aggravate this situation. So, for instance, for a long time, if you're renting, rents have been increasing above inflation. The very formula that's used to set rents within the sector is a above inflation formula for increasing rents. Now, we know that the government have been consulting recently on a potential cap. It's a short-term cap for maybe 1 or 2 years, but it's still a cap which is above inflation. So it would still be 3, 5 or 7% as an increase above, which you're looking at. So it's still significant increases in rent. At the same time, we've heard a little bit about shared owners as well, and the increasing. By nature, often shared owners need to demonstrate that their employment, there's a kind of a degree of additional income that might be coming in, but they were excluded within the consultation on the cap on the rents. So again, are likely to have CPI plus an additional inflator. And with CPI, what, 10 or so % plus is an increase in the rental element components of the shared ownership. I would imagine that this situation is just going to get worse and worse.
And their mortgage. And their mortgage.
And the mortgage as well, absolutely. I mean, this is a really well-observed point, and harks back to some of the observations that I made about the kind of foundational underlying issues which are really enduring, really difficult to address. You can't present a situation where people are expected to meet their essential expenditure when the biggest strand of an essential expenditure for most is the mortgage payment or the rent payment, and that is already overwhelming and growing at a rate which exceeds the growth of their income. That's a really well-observed point. This is a reason why we've got these partnerships with housing providers, with shelter, with other organisations that have a real specialism in this type of work, because we acknowledge that without those fundamental issues being addressed at policy level, we're in a really difficult place, and we need policy change in order to make that better. But very well observed, Darren. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to bring in John and then Brian.
Thank you, Leslie.
Hello, John.
Hi, Leslie. One of the things that I do wonder is how much of this has been accidental or designed by governments. There are a lot of good community people out there and organisations like yourself that are picking up the slack. But that can't go on indefinitely before a disaster will hit large sections of our community. And I just wonder, with your knowledge and expertise, have you any idea of the real true figures of how people are suffering? Because I think it's just hidden at the moment.
That's a really good point. Thanks, John. I think we can give you chapter and verse on that. You know, if we're talking about the real life impact, what we've started doing recently at the Trust is an initiative called Together for Change. And that Together for Change program is a key focus of that program is to bring in service users, the people that have actually had to access food bank support, talk to them about their lived experience of what it is to be in poverty and to have to access the food bank support network. That's one point, and I think that's really compelling in terms of being able to demonstrate how big this problem is, because that will give you in-depth qualitative as well as the quantitative data that we capture to prove how much of a significant issue is. On your other point about whether this is built into the design of what goes on at a policy and a government level, the answer, I'm afraid, is yes. Our welfare benefits system is punitive, right? So any opportunity that they get to sanction you, to remove your benefits, to put you in a position where over the slightest infringement, you might argue sometimes, they will remove or suspend a benefit. It points in the direction of them not wanting to pay welfare support and them not being in the kind of mindset, the kind of position where that is an acceptable thing. So this comes back to many of the observations that have been made in the chat about the deserving poor, the undeserving poor, whether or not people are entitled to this or not entitled to this. And that's an ongoing problem.
Yeah. Can I just interject that there was a report at the DWP about deaths attributed to being sanctioned, and it was buried before one of the ministers left. Now, I know that there has been research, Danny Dorling and others have just that there's been, you know, like 300,000 excess deaths attributed to the situation we find ourselves in now. And there is kind of growing evidence. So hopefully that report will be published at some point. But yeah, it is absolutely harrowing that actually more people have died due to welfare benefit sanctions and being ignored or being denied than have died in the pandemic. And that's absolutely harrowing to hear that.
There's similar work done around the impact of austerity measures. The empirical evidence around that is that it's been fundamentally counterproductive and that lives have been lost as a result of austerity measures.
I'm going to bring in Brian. Oh, sorry.
Leslie, can I just say, just further to the structural issues, again, to bring it back to the housing issues, not just on the revenue side as well. So just so that maybe Sim can take some of this away with him. What we're also seeing on the capital side in terms of funding, the reason why you've got above inflation rental increases is because existing tenants living within the sector are subsidizing new supply. That's the way. So it's the policy design which has been in place for the last decade is that existing tenants subsidize new housing supply at the expense of capital payments being made to landlords where they would have previously received grants for new supply. And in fact, even further than that, the grant availability for that has had conditions that the grant, a very small amount, a limited grant has been available if you charge a rent at a higher so-called affordable 80% of market rate, or it's for home ownership forms of housing as opposed to it being truly rented housing. So the CIH have done some reports over a number of years, part of their annual housing review, to compare the level of subsidy that's been going in to home ownership products relative to rented products, and the disparity has been growing as well. There's quite a significant greater amount of subsidy that goes into home ownership than what there is for rented housing products. So over to Brian.
It's when you talk about policy change, do you my grasp on this is that it's not necessarily a policy change, but a society change. where many years ago, the concept of without stigma, without trauma or anything else being involved, that the opportunity to be a social tenant was grasped by major sections of society who knew that home ownership was a goal, was a dream, was something they wanted, and they worked towards. But the first opportunity to be in a home, and I hate it when people use the term house. A house is something that is bricks and mortar for to live in, but a home is a place that's lived in. And the whole attitude, the whole concept of being able to provide, and it came out starkly with Help the Heroes, you know, a home for these people to live in who've come back from fighting in conflicts, and I'm a extremely passive believer. I don't believe in that anything should ever end up in conflict like we have, but the whole society impact has changed from a society to a profit. If there's no profit at the end of it, the policy is geared towards profit. Like Darren's just been saying, the amount of money going into private purchase of property against what's going into social housing is astronomical. You know, you're talking about, and I remember from the area I'm living in, where the chief executive got questioned about his bonus figure, and ended up, you know, went totally silent because somebody had the guts to turn around and ask him, "Are you justified in getting that amount of money?" You know,
I think that those 2 points are so kind of inextricably connected. It's probably fair to say, you know, in the same sort of way you would ask the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the policy change or the societal change? And actually, let's acknowledge within all of that how difficult it is to bring about cultural societal change. You know, that's the whole notion of it being like a glacial movement, a movement of 1 degree on the huge oil tanker that's going to put you in a reasonable position when you get 6 years, 10 years down the line or something like that. None of us have the expectation that there's going to be any high five moments anytime soon. None of this is going to be transformational change. It all has to be tweaking the policy, tweaking the government view at a certain stage in the process where X number of months or years down the line, you can expect there to be some improvements, fundamental improvements potentially, but more likely subtle improvements that are going to make things better. I agree with your point entirely, Brian. I think that's a very well observed kind of question to raise. John.
Yeah, thanks, Sim. One of the things, picking up on what Brian said, a politician of many years ago, in 7 words, summed it all up: there is no such thing as society. And unfortunately, that political agenda in that particular party seems to have multiplied, and we're getting into a situation where the bottom line comes first, shareholders comes first, and we seem to forget about the more vulnerable sections of society. And they class themselves as a caring government. But I'm afraid my experience, and I think some other people's experience, is that's not the case. Why are organizations now having to divert resources and moving away from their focused agenda into supporting tenants and residents to get through these difficult times? I mean, I'll give you an organization called DEFA. It used to just be local in Blackburn, where it helped residents who were struggling, were elderly, were on benefits with heating issues. It's now developed into a huge industry nationally. Industry is the wrong word, but it's now delivering aid and assistance all over the country. That shouldn't be needed in this society today, surely.
With one eye on the time, I'm going to say that this is all traced back to the desire to make profit the priority. Yeah. So we are not prioritizing well-being. We're not prioritizing tenancies and making them work in a way which is going to be to the benefit of the landlord, to the benefit of the tenant. Instead, we're producing properties which are put together in the most maximum profit margin way. Therefore, they're not well insulated. Therefore, they're not run in the most effective way. They're not affordable. All these different factors that play in. And sadly, a lot of the points that have been made today, a lot of the observations that have been put forward are traced back to the idea that profit is the overriding objective rather than other things which should be as important, if not more important.
Absolutely. So I can see we're really low on time. Deb, could we go to you maybe 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up if that's okay?
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly, one of the things that we've found is, and I've just listened, the last words, and that they absolutely strike a chord. We can't find anyone else to help. We can't get local authorities to engage. We can't get them to answer the phone. We have no idea. And please do not quote it's COVID, because I ain't having that. That's disappeared as far as I'm concerned. The other thing is, please, we are housing associations. We're not perfect, but we are encountering many who won't leave their houses. It's a mental health issue. We can't access health services. And in one of the areas I work in, forget the GP, we've had issues with an American provider. We've got a 3-year waiting list for NHS dentistry, and all of that knocks on for health and well-being. And it just is a perfect storm. And the last thing is, I know we're not great, and I know there's damp and mold, and I know there's lots of those issues, but you want to see some of the states and the voids we inherit from people who have woefully neglected their properties, and properties that really weren't that bad. And that has a cost, and that's hitting the bottom line. And you're right, money makes the world go round, and profit is their raison d'etre, but it doesn't help when we have to keep fixing issues that really shouldn't be something we need to fix at all.
Yeah, agreed.
Good to you, Darren.
Yeah, point well said, Deb. I think perfect storms is an often used term at the moment, isn't it? But it's entirely appropriate when we're discussing this, and I think it highlights the really valuable work that the Trussell Trust are doing in order to mitigate some of the more savage impacts that we're seeing about the broader policy picture and the massive impact the cost of living crisis is having on people's lives. So a big thank you to all the work that the Trussell Trust are doing, and thank you for Sim coming today to explain about your really valuable work. It's much appreciated. Just we're of time, therefore, just a kind of a shout out really to say we haven't got a webinar next week, but we've got one on the 30th. And we've had massive demand for this one. It's Stigma, Wicked Problem on the 30th of November. So looking forward to that. And pick up some of the things which we've been highlighting today as well. Some really well-made comments there around stigma and cost of living. We've added another date to our program of hashtag Wednesday webinars and
Webinar Wednesdays.
Well, thank you. Hashtag Webinar Wednesday. Oh, social media, I don't know. The next, we've got a further one, which is 14th of December, which is going to be about furniture poverty, and some of the work that the FRC have been doing around there. They've just completed a recent research report, and what landlords can do to help assist tenants to set up and maintain a tenancy, and the value that furniture provision has within that whole landscape.
And floors.
And floors, yes.
Yes,
flooring, flooring, absolutely. And that's one of the key things which is highlighted in the research report as well. So yeah, well said, Leslie. Okay, so thank you. I hope that you found today's session valuable. The chat has been great in terms of all of the really positive comments that people have been making. We'll get this up onto YouTube shortly, and just remains to say really big thank you to everybody for joining us and supporting us as usual. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Sim. It's been a pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Hi, Leslie.
Yes.
Before you go, it's lovely to see you looking healthy.
Oh, thank you.